Hey everyone, Ryan here, and in this video we're going to be comparing the 2019 LEGO Star Wars UCS Imperial Star Destroyer to the 2023 LEGO Star Wars UCS Venator Class Republic Attack Cruiser. With these two incredible UCS sets, we'll be comparing the packaging, minifigures, aesthetics, stability, and value for money to find out which of these is better. Oh, and this video is sponsored by Rakuten, so more on them later. Starting with the packaging, the first thing you notice is the all-black box art on the Venator, contrasting to the very beautiful actual art on the UCS Imperial Star Destroyer. Now, the all-black art was a big shift that LEGO underwent in 2020, and while at the time I think it was new and exciting, it definitely has gotten a bit stale, as it literally is the same thing every time, versus a set like the Star Destroyer, which presents so beautifully with Tatooine looming in the background and the stars from space, and I just feel like having actual art on boxes really is the way to go, although I understand the marketing reason behind it and LEGO wanting to pull more adults into buying their product. Now, on the left side of the Star Destroyer box, they have a large image of the dimensions of the Star Destroyer. This is only found as a small cutaway on the back of the Venator box, and at that, it doesn't even give you the third dimension that you would need, being the width. The back of these boxes are laid out pretty similarly, although the Star Destroyer one has actual art showing the shipyards where the Star Destroyers would be built. And when you contrast that to the Venator, you see what they do more modern day, where they include either movie or, obviously in this case, Clone Wars TV show clips of the ship that they are trying to sell you. And then the other side of the box shows the backside of each ship, although with the Star Destroyer, they kind of give you the underside view as well, because the Venator actually has the cooler concept with the box for this part of it, where the bottom of the box shows the bottom of the Venator and the top of the box shows the top of the Venator. Now, inside of each box, things are quite different as well. With the Imperial Star Destroyer, the instructions were literally inside of their own box, and it was one large, nicely bound manual, versus the Venator, which had 4 separate manuals split up between the 2 boxes inside, and they did have their own protection with little sleeves, but the Star Destroyer literally had a cool decorated box, and it's one big manual, which is a cooler experience if you're just one person building, like to have the one huge manual, I think, although to have more than one person build it at a time, having 4 manuals is definitely optimal. When it comes to the packaging, there's a lot to consider. There's even more that I didn't even talk about here, but I think I'm leaning towards the Venator. I know I said the all-black art got a bit stale, and it has, but it still looks dang good on this particular set. But perhaps the true reason for my choice is the interior box art. Getting the Revenge of the Sith box art inside of a set like this, it just hit me right in the feels. It's something I haven't felt in a long time. When it comes to the minifigs, both of these sets include 2, which I will stand by is the right number, although some people argue that sets that cost $650 or $700 should include far more, despite not having space for them inside. I can totally get behind that argument too, but I'm perfectly fine with 2. But when it comes to a UCS set, I'm looking for UCS level minifigs, and I think only one of these sets does deliver on that. Now, in the Star Destroyer, you had an unnamed Imperial officer and an unnamed Imperial crew member versus the named characters that we see in the Venator with Admiral Yularen and the Phase 2 Captain Rex. And in a vacuum, if you were just telling me which characters came in which sets and I couldn't look at them, I would tell you the Venators are probably better. But the pink elephant in the room is clearly Captain Rex. For whatever reason, LEGO Star Wars has decided to make Clone Troopers not that good anymore, and in a $650 set, it is ultimately inexcusable that Captain Rex, frankly, just isn't that good. And so when you put Yularen next to the Imperial officer, you know, outside of the officer not being a named character, for all intents and purposes, both of those characters are of equal quality, versus the Imperial crew member, who LEGO did give arm printing and some very nice leg printing to, much like we see with Captain Rex, who has arm printing and leg printing. But what it comes down to between these 2 arm printing figures is that with the crew member, he didn't necessarily need anything extra. He didn't need a special helmet. He didn't need a smaller pauldron. He didn't need a waist cape. But Captain Rex did need those things, and Captain Rex didn't get those things, and for a $650 set, I find that to be entirely inexcusable, not to mention that these things could be reused in smaller, less expensive sets, and LEGO would certainly make their money on that sort of thing, plus they would win over fans who just want to see good things. So at the end of the day, when you're looking at the minifigs between these 2 sets, while I do really appreciate the named characters in the Venator, I think it just comes down to the quality, and for $650, Captain Rex just isn't there. The winner on minifigs is the Star Destroyer, although if LEGO cared, the Venator would have won pretty handily because it had the potential, but it didn't deliver. How a UCS set looks is obviously one of the biggest factors that goes into your purchasing decision. Now, with these 2 sets specifically, I think there's 5 subcategories that we can look at to find out which one has the better aesthetic, including the stand, the stickers, the colors, the size, and especially with these 2, the gap. Starting with the stand on the 2019 Star Destroyer, I don't love the aesthetic of it. It makes it feel like it's from the shipyard of Corellia, like the Star Destroyer's like being built, which honestly isn't terrible. comparable, I suppose, but it's just not what I'm looking for. I would have wanted something a little bit sleeker, ideally, and that is ultimately what we ended up getting with the UCS Venator. I just think the stand looks far better. It doesn't have the pieces bridging the gap between both ends of the main part of the stand. I think that looks particularly odd and creates this very large rectangle at the bottom that can take away a little bit from the look of the Star Destroyer. So I do think the Venator's stand overall is sleeker. It's got less studs showing. It just doesn't have that same industrial look, and I definitely prefer the stand on that Venator. Now, when it comes to stickers, the Imperial Star Destroyer doesn't really have stickers except for the display plaque. So when it comes to that, I suppose you could point that out. But what I'm really looking at here is the stickers on the actual model itself, which the Star Destroyer has none of. But the Venator, unfortunately, does have a few stickers that, while they do add detail, I think they make the model look less cohesive than it would otherwise if they had just gone and printed it and stopped being cheap. It's pretty clear that for whatever reason, they can't match the sticker color to the Lego brick color in a lot of cases, and so it just looks off no matter how you put it. It's just not gonna look right. So ultimately, you do wish things like this were printed because of how weird it does end up looking. Kind of in the same vein, we have the color scheme of each ship, but this is more big picture. So with the Star Destroyer, they went with the standard Imperial Star Destroyer, the one that everyone and their mother would recognize. However, with the Venator, while it's still clearly a Venator, everyone and their mother that knows what a Venator is will still know that's a Venator. It's in a color scheme that is not as iconic as the most iconic version of the Venator, and I will always think that is a weird choice in this particular case. There's a few things that in choosing the Resolute Venator, Lego's aesthetic for this set kind of fell off. That would be the red bridge on top. I just think the gray bridge looks better on the Venator, just straight up. I also think the big red stripe in the middle being one continuous red stripe, kind of like we see in Revenge of the Sith, is also the better look for the top side of a Venator, as opposed to kind of the stepped cutout design that we see. And then finally, there's a lot more dark gray on the front of the Venator. But when it comes down to it, the color scheme chosen for that Venator is probably not the best one. It's not far from the best one, but it's still not the best one. And I do wish it was in the more iconic kind of standard Venator design. So I was thinking about this a bit more, and I think that the Tantive also adds on to the aesthetic of the Star Destroyer. Meanwhile, I think that the micro gunship and the hangar of the Venator doesn't add on at all. I think it actually takes away from the aesthetic as well, because it's just plain ugly, made out of like 3 pieces. It's great that it's in scale and all, but it would have just been better omitted. Now, the engines are another area where you can make the argument that the Venator suffers, not because they don't look really good, but because they definitely have a small degree of sag, and it's noticeable. I've had this set put together for many months now, and they definitely have a small sag to them that you just do not see on the UCS Imperial Star Destroyer. So just a couple more things that I thought were important to talk about between these two sets. Now, what else is important to talk about? Today's sponsor, Rakuten. I've been using Rakuten for years to get extra cash back on purchases I was already going to make, and if you didn't know, Rakuten is the largest cashback site, and they partner with over 3,500 of the biggest name brands, such as Lego, Kohl's, Target, Walmart, etc. You know, places you might buy Lego. And if you ever want to buy a set like the UCS Venator, a site like Lego.com offers 1.5% extra cash back on your purchase. That's an extra $9.75 back in your pocket, and all you had to do was click through the link on the Rakuten website, or with the web browser installed, it'll pop up for you so you don't forget, click activate, and you're good to go to get your cash back. To sign up, simply click the link in the description and you'll get a $30 sign-up bonus when you make a qualifying purchase. I truly think Rakuten is a great tool to put extra cash back in your pocket, and you should be taking advantage of it, especially if you're ever going to buy something as expensive as a UCS Venator. Speaking of, now the size of each set is also something that's interesting. A lot of people will sit there and say the Venator is the same size as the Star Destroyer, and that is only true in one single dimension, being the length. They are both the exact same length, but both of these sets are not the same size. The Venator is much sleeker than the Star Destroyer in basically every way. It's just incredibly slim by comparison, and that's just how it is. It's not a good thing, it's not a bad thing. They're both accurately proportioned, and you know, they've got all of the details down that you would want for their particular versions of the ships that they're supposed to represent. So there's not really a problem with the size, but when it comes to the aesthetic, maybe you do like the more imposing look of the Star Destroyer. I think that's the best way that I can describe the Star Destroyer when you see it next to that Venator there. It's just a more imposing looking ship, and maybe the single gray color is also more imposing to you. So that's 4 of our 5 subcategories, and finally we have to talk about the gap on the top of each Star Destroyer. It's just one of those inherent things that's going to show up when you're designing something like this, and it was a bigger problem I think in the 2002 Imperial Star Destroyer. I think with this new 2019 Star Destroyer, they did a decent job covering up that gap a little bit on top, and then integrating some light gray pieces as close to the surface as possible to kind of make it look as close to as seamless as they could. However, I do think the Venator clearly beats out the Star Destroyer here, as the gap on top is just significantly less noticeable. It's just so much closer to seamless like you would want. The winner of the aesthetics category is going to be the Imperial Star Destroyer. Outside of the stand and the slightly smaller gap on top of the Venator, I think the Star Destroyer has a lot more going for it. I thought design stability and kind of how you pick up each model would be a fun thing to talk about here, because it's kind of important. If you ever want to move one of these sets from one room to another, or God forbid, from one house to another, there's times where it might feel like it's just a hope and a prayer that it won't fall to pieces as you're transporting it. And so with the Star Destroyer specifically, it does feel very wobbly on its stand. I mean, just slightly shaking the table completely shakes the model. And it's very much a front to back motion. It's not so much side to side movement, so it's just kind of inherently how it was designed. But you'll notice the Venator is a lot less susceptible to any kind of shake because the stand was just better designed. It's stronger. It's more well integrated into the frame of the Venator as you're building the set. And then of course, when it comes to picking up and moving each set with the Star Destroyer, there's actually a couple of methods. You can just place both hands underneath in the proper spots and lift it up, and you're kind of good to go. Although this method has always felt a little bit shaky to me. I always feel like the plates are going to break. And so I would typically opt for one of the most interesting carrying solutions ever in a LEGO Star Wars set, and that's the handle within the Star Destroyer. You actually have to pull off a couple parts from the top of it to access it, but it's pretty clearly denoted with some red pieces that that's the part you're supposed to grab. And so theoretically, you could lift it up with just one hand, but it's rather back heavy, so you really need to put a hand underneath the engine area on the back to balance it out. But it's a really convenient way to carry the thing. I guess convenient in the sense that it doesn't feel like it's going to break, not convenient in the way that you have to like pull things off the ship to be able to carry it. But when it comes to the Venator, you won't find any sort of like interior integrated stand. They certainly didn't have space. I mean, it's obviously much skinnier than the Star Destroyer was, but they also didn't need it. They built it well enough, and it's probably just not as heavy, that the plates on the bottom are more than capable of allowing you to lift up the Venator. And it also feels relatively swooshable. It's never felt like it's going to break apart in my hand. Nothing falls off when I swoosh it around. It's actually a really fun model to play around with. So overall, I think both for stability of the model and like when it comes to picking it up, the Venator is the better set. When it comes to value for money, some people like to put a lot of stock into price per piece, in which case the UCS Venator would win. And if that's the way you like to look at it, then the UCS Venator is the better value for you. But I think it should be a little bit more nuanced. I think it's pretty clear that the Star Destroyer is obviously a bigger model when it came in at $700 versus the $650 of the UCS Venator. Now, I do also have to add that the inflation adjusted release price of the Star Destroyer, if it were to be released now, would be about $850 as opposed to the $650 for the Venator. So it's really about a $200 price bump. But I will say, just kind of eyeballing it, it looks like about a $200 size bump. It's just quite a bit larger. It might not show in the piece count, but it clearly uses larger plates to accomplish its larger design. It's also definitely heavier, although I don't want to get in the whole price per gram thing. I just don't think calculating based on either of those things is necessarily important. What I do think is important is the eye test at the end of the day. Do you look at it and do you think it's worth the money? And that is one of the most subjective things when it comes to LEGO collecting and just reviewing LEGO sets. And maybe I have the wrong perspective on this, because I see a lot of people say every LEGO set ever is overpriced, but I also look at a lot of LEGO sets, I'm like, yeah, in the scale of LEGO sets and compared to other LEGO sets, that seems like a fair value. And I think with both the Star Destroyer and the Venator here, I can look at both of them, and I think even for $850, but really the $700 release price in 2019, the Star Destroyer was a fair price. With the Venator for $650, I also look at that and I'm like, outside of Captain Rex being a poor quality figure for $650, I think that set is overall a good value for your money. And so I think in both cases, they're both pretty good value for money. I don't think one stands out over the other to me as either being like an insanely good value or insanely bad value. I'm going to call it a tie here between the Star Destroyer and the Venator. Having gone through our 5 scoring categories, we find ourselves in a dead tie. And if I was going to break the tie here, I would lean towards that 2019 UCS Star Destroyer. I think it's the more perfect, flawless model. And at this level of LEGO set, I mean, that's kind of how you have to describe it, because they are both very, very good LEGO sets, but one of them ultimately is going to edge out the other. And I think for a couple reasons that I went pretty in depth on throughout this video, the Star Destroyer is slightly better than that UCS Venator for me. And so if I was going to pick one over the other and I could only ever own one, I would go for the Star Destroyer. Now, if you own the Star Destroyer and maybe you're thinking of selling it to buy the Venator, I don't necessarily not recommend that. I do think it's kind of cool to move on from one thing in your collection and move on to the other. And especially given the Venator's price would be subsidized substantially, if not entirely free, based on the sale of your Star Destroyer, it's not an entirely bad move, and it can give you something new and exciting to own. So if you were thinking of doing that, that could definitely be something fun for you. But at the end of the day, I think the Star Destroyer is the slightly better UCS set, but it's pretty clear here that LEGO Star Wars has also done the UCS Venator justice. Both of these are fantastic sets, and ultimately, if you have the opportunity to have both within your collection, I would highly, highly recommend it. Anyway, let me know which set you like better in the comment section below. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, and you can check out more LEGO Star Wars set comparisons on the end screen now.